You're listening to episode 65 of the Fed and Fearless podcast. On today's episode, Amy Hollenkamp is here to talk about the biggest IBS and SIBO mistakes that you're making and what to do instead. So stay tuned.
Hi, I'm Laura Schoenfeld. I'm a registered dietitian and coach trained in functional medicine with a passion for helping women just like you ditch perfectionism and use food, fitness, and self-care to fuel your bigger God-given purpose. I believe that it's possible to achieve your biggest life-changing goals without the frustration, obsession, or negative self-talk that so many women subject themselves to every day. All you need are the right tools, the right mindset, and the faith to turn your dreams into reality. I'm here to guide you along the way. The truth is that you are so much more than a body, and I'm on a mission to help you change the way you think and act at a core beliefs level so you can transform your physical, mental, and spiritual health from the inside out. Are you ready to become fed and fearless in your pursuit of a healthy, meaningful life? Welcome to the Fed and Fearless podcast.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the Fed and Fearless podcast. I'm Laura Schoenfeld, I'm your host as always, and we have a really important episode for you today if you're someone who struggles with IBS or SIBO. If you're not familiar with what SIBO is, SIBO stands for small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, and it is one of the most common causes of IBS. And IBS is actually a very common condition. The last stats that I saw is that 1 in 5 people in the United States have IBS. So if you have IBS, you're certainly not alone. And even if you don't have IBS, you probably know someone who does. So this is going to be a very important episode for anyone who wants to make sure that they are dealing with their IBS, and if they have SIBO, that they're dealing with their SIBO appropriately. Now, I have worked with a lot of people with digestive issues, including IBS and SIBO, and I can tell you that the topic that we cover today with my special guest is something that I saw all the time. So it's something that is ubiquitous in the digestive health community and especially in the SIBO community, and that is food fears. Food fears are something that can make a huge impact in your ability to overcome these digestive issues. And the crazy thing is that food fear and disordered eating can actually cause IBS. So we want to make sure that if somebody is healing from IBS or trying to get rid of those symptoms, or if they are trying to eliminate SIBO, that they're not doing it in a way that's going to create or exacerbate disordered eating or fear around food. So my guest today is someone who I trust so much to work with people with SIBO to help make sure that they're not developing food fears while they are eliminating their SIBO. And she's someone who has worked for me in the past, has helped me with my blog and my content that I was putting out on my website. So she's someone that I trust a lot in a lot of different areas, and especially the world of IBS and digestive health. So our guest today is Amy Hollenkamp. Amy is a registered dietitian on a mission to help her clients with SIBO and IBS overcome their symptoms so they can return to their true purpose. Amy focuses on digging to the root causes of her clients' symptoms so they can find lasting relief without restrictive diets. Amy writes about her own battle and her history with SIBO and her latest SIBO insights in her blog, the SIBO Diaries. So we're going to be talking about food fears with SIBO and IBS, how to overcome those food fears, how to really overcome SIBO without having to go on super restrictive diets, and some of the main root causes of SIBO that you can work on so that you can eliminate SIBO from the root up. So all of that to say, I think it's a really great episode. Super excited to have Amy on the show. And without further ado, here is Amy Hollenkamp. All right, everyone. Well, I am super pumped to have with me today Amy Hollenkamp. Welcome to the show, Amy.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, well, you and I go back pretty far. I feel like I can't remember what year you started working for me, or I guess I'm trying to remember. I think we worked together first and then you started working for me. Am I remembering correctly?
Yeah, no, I feel like it was like 2015 or 16.
It must have been pretty early.
Yeah, it was fairly early on, but it was really fun to like learn from you. And I think with you too, it's such an interesting dynamic between hormones and gut health, and learning more about like the hormonal piece from doing stuff with you was really helpful for me in the gut health space, because there's so many connections there.
Yeah. So we've worked together and you've worked for me, and I haven't worked for you yet, but maybe we'll see if that happens one day.
Hashtag goals.
So anyway, I'm super pumped to have you on the show because you're like my resident SIBO expert. And I know that it's unfortunately, a very common issue that a lot of people are dealing with. So hopefully there will be a lot of people on the show today that get help, or maybe if you know someone who's struggling with IBS and other types of digestive symptoms that can be related to SIBO, that what we talk about today can help that person in your life. So before we get started with the meat of the interview, I would love to hear your story. I think I know a lot about your story because, again, working together for the last several years. But for those of our listeners that don't know you, can you just kind of briefly or in a nutshell share your story and why you're so passionate about helping people overcome SIBO?
Yeah, for sure. The SIBO space is very interesting because a lot of people have very similar stories that I do, where when I was in grad school, especially, that's when I started to have more chronic gut issues. Maybe before that, I was having some bloating or discomfort if I had certain foods, but it wasn't anything that was disruptive of my life. So in grad school, there was more stress. I was living at home, which might have added a little bit more stress to the situation too. And so just over time, I started to get more bloating, more discomfort, and it was like becoming an everyday thing. I was struggling to go to the bathroom every day, so dealing with constipation. And just over time, it kept getting worse and worse. I got a new job after I graduated, and that sort of was the straw that broke the camel's back, in my opinion, where my gut was like, I've had enough. And the pain got really bad. I started to get refluxy type symptoms too. And I was like, I have to figure out what's going on. So I went to the conventional docs at first, like most people do, where they go to the gastro, they go to a specialist to figure out what's going on. So when I went to the specialist, they were like, we're going to figure this out. We're going to run all these tests. So you're like, okay, like that sounds good. And they ran the tests. They're like, everything's normal. I guess you just have IBS. And then it's like, well, now what? Like, there's not really much that they can do for IBS besides maybe send some Metamucil your way, or like some very like pretty basic things that might even aggravate people that have SIBO. So I was an analyst at that time. So just right out the gate, it didn't make sense to me. Like, something's deeper going on here. It's not just IBS. I can't really deal with it. Like, the conventional system kind of made it sound like that I could it wasn't going to kill me. I just had to deal with it. So I found a functional practitioner in my area and was diagnosed relatively quickly with SIBO. So methane SIBO, which is actually sort of newly transitioning to a different name, but methane predominant overgrowth is essentially, it can be small or large intestine now, but methane SIBO, so to speak, by common knowledge and common vernacular. So I was diagnosed with methane SIBO, and that was like, oh man, like this is it. This is like my answer to why I'm having all these symptoms. And so I was super pumped, and it was like, all I have to do is just like take some things to clear it out. Like, things are going to be fine after this. Like, I'm going to be good to go. So I took some rounds of herbals, which is a common treatment for SIBO. So I took herbals, and I wasn't really feeling much better, maybe slightly. And then my doc was like, you need to just like go hard and like hit it with antibiotics. And at the time, rifaximin, which is the common antibiotic used for SIBO, was really hard to get. There was like a period where it was like not covered by insurance, like at all. And so it was $1,600. And so like a lot of docs wouldn't even run it. So I ended up not doing that. I did CPRO, which is probably a horrible mistake on my end to do because it sort of set me back. But I basically went through the ringer in the SIBO space, doing a lot of clearing, doing a lot of restrictive dieting. I did common SIBO diets like low FODMAP, SIBO specific diet, more low carb. So I kind of had low carb in there. So I was stacking a lot of different things on top of each other, which I know now is never a good thing to do. So I tended to get worse and worse on this track of like restricting and clearing consecutively. So it was really hard on my gut. It was like constant killing. I had a mission to destroy the SIBO, and every symptom was SIBO. So I was down that track. And it took hitting like a very low point in order to shift my mindset to look at, well, why do I have SIBO? Because I was viewing it as a root cause. And when you view it as a root cause, like there's only so many mechanisms you can use to alleviate the pain, to get long-term results, which the only thing you can really think to do is clear it. But I think when I started to pull back the layers of why I had SIBO, I could see that there were motility issues, there were digestive insufficiency issues going on. And so really to beat the SIBO, I had to address the causes of those things. So like what breakdowns were leading to the environment to become friendly for SIBO. And that's a really big missing piece from what I see working with people. A lot of people are stuck in that very vicious cycle of just clearing or restricting diet-wise, and they never look deeper, or they're not working with anyone that's looking deeper. And it's just a very frustrating track to be on, because unless you figure out what the SIBO is rooted in, it's hard to move forward. So for me, it was kind of like a long journey of like putting various pieces together for getting rid of the SIBO and understanding what can be driving the SIBO on my end. And over time and through a lot of research and working with people, I've sort of created programs to help people do so, address the root causes, get a really good understanding of what's driving their SIBO. So is that a good summary of my story?
Well, I will say, I think you might know better than me if it's a good summary, but I think it sounds accurate from what I remember. So
cool.
Yeah. And because I know that one of the things that you and I dealt with was that restrictive dieting. And it wasn't because you had like weight loss goals or something like that. It was because you were so concerned about how the food you were eating was going to feed SIBO. And just we'll make sure that people understand SIBO stands for small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. I know we've been like throwing that word out a lot. And at this point, I feel like SIBO is a more commonly understood condition, but still, I just want to make sure people know what we're actually saying. I do remember that malnutrition essentially was a big part of the symptoms you were experiencing, not only digestively, but also in general, just not feeling well. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I think sometimes people don't like, not fixing SIBO is bad enough, but like you actually had problems come up from the method you were using.
Yeah, this is an area that I'm super passionate about. I believe, like deep in my soul, that the SIBO space is a recipe for food fears, disordered eating patterns, and it's something you have to be very careful of. And I know from personal experience that I had food fears and disordered eating patterns that were hard to break. And just working with people, I'd say probably 90% of the people I work with are under eating, are fearful of foods. Like there's a lot of work we have to do on their relationship with food, on making sure that they're well nourished. I really try my best to shift the thinking away from what foods to cut and really get back into the mindset of how can I nourish my body? Because the actual nourishment piece gets very lost in the sauce when you're cutting a whole bunch of foods out. I don't know how you can nourish your body if you're cutting like every food out that you can think of and stacking a lot of different diets on top of each other. It's just a recipe for nutrient deficiencies, food fears, a lot of dysfunction. And I do feel like that keeps people unwell. Like that's a very big mistake I see people making, is not getting nourished. If you're not nourished, it's hard to beat any issue that you're having. And SIBO is not an exception to that rule. So it's a big first step when I work with people is like, where are their overall calories falling? And I do think it's tricky because if there are symptoms present, it does sometimes make it hard to achieve optimal nutrition. So I get that piece of it, but there's so much of the mental piece too that's at play. So it's basically, how can we overcome the mental and physical barriers that could be preventing getting enough nutrition in? And that can be challenging, but definitely can be done.
Yeah. And from my experience, having worked with, and I don't do too many health clients anymore. So, but what I was going to say is, having worked with a lot of people with SIBO, it's kind of interesting how disordered eating is so often either a cause of SIBO or a contributor to SIBO because people develop it trying to get rid of SIBO. So it's like, the fact that, I know you agree with me on this, that disordered eating can actually lead to the development of small intestinal bacterial overgrowth in the first place, then trying to use disordered eating patterns to fix SIBO, it's like, I don't get why more practitioners don't understand that. Like, I don't understand how it's so prevalent in the SIBO community that the answer to SIBO is to eliminate foods and restrict and, use antibiotics or antimicrobials, and that's the solution. And it's like, and not that there isn't a role for certain like elimination protocols or, supplements, that kind of thing. But I feel like so many people don't get the full healing that they need, or they actually develop other problems because of the way that there's that remove and avoid kind of mentality with food rather than, emphasize certain things, or, if you're going to remove certain things, like making sure you're replacing it with something else.
100%. I totally concur. And I think my frustration is that with the SIBO space, and I do think even like the functional medicine integrative space, I don't want to lump everyone into that, but as a whole in the SIBO realm, there's so much emphasis on the restriction and there's no looking at the actual composition of the diet. So like, what does that mean? Like, what does restricting these foods mean to that person? Like, what are they actually eating? And I think that there's so much focus too on like supplements and labs, and like you kind of go down the rabbit hole of how you're going to vanquish the SIBO, and it's so aggressive that like the diet end of things becomes very aggressive too. But, just like we were saying, the nutrition piece gets lost. And I also think like a lot of the practitioners that are putting these protocols together are not dietitians, are not people that really understand nutrition on a deeper level and are concerned about, composition of the diet, what nutrients are depleted, those sorts of things. I feel like that gets very much lost. And I also think that the killing aspect and the clearing also does a big harm on the microbiome as a whole. So like if your goal in SIBO is try to starve the SIBO out, which is usually the goal of most people that are on these diets, it really depletes good gut bugs in a lot of different ways. I know low FODMAP has been shown to lower bifidobacteria levels, which are needed to have a healthy microbiome, to prevent leaky gut, to help stimulate proper motility in the nervous system, to activate the vagus nerve, those sorts of things. Like your microbiome gets really affected if you're on these restrictive diets too, and that gets lost as well. There's only so much killing and clearing that's helpful. And at some point, there has to be a shift into repairing and rebuilding the things that are broken or need some repair. So those things that can help keep your small intestines clear of bacteria. We have mechanisms that do these things. We have things like we have digestive enzymes, we have motility processes that keep the small intestines clear and that help balance the microbiome in the small intestines. So when the focus becomes all about food and killing, these key pieces of why that bacterial overgrowth is there in the first place get really lost. So it really frustrates me in the SIBO space that it's so kill focused and there isn't a switch in a reasonable amount of time that I think is necessary for people to get better. I think our current paradigm is not working. And sometimes the response I get to that is, oh, SIBO is just chronic, which I don't think is an accurate statement. Or I've seen people move on from SIBO. I've seen a lot of people move on from SIBO and get better. So I just think the current paradigm and the current strategies that are really popular aren't really working and moving the needle because of some of these issues we're describing.
Yeah. Well, and you said at the beginning of our recording that SIBO in and of itself is not generally a root cause. So if you're not treating the root cause, of course, something's going to be chronic, right? Like if you're like taking Advil every time you have a headache and you actually have a brain tumor, you know, you can't say, well, these headaches are untreatable because the Advil like isn't doing the job. It's like, well, maybe if you remove the brain tumor, that would be fine, right? So I know that's an extreme example, but you know, I totally agree with you that you get these people into the situation where they don't believe the SIBO is fixable, which we don't. I mean, maybe we can talk about the mindset piece, but I'm very interested in mindset and like beliefs and how your beliefs affect not only your actions, but also like the physical results that you're getting. But even if you don't believe that SIBO is in like not treatable, if you're not actually dealing with the issues that led to the SIBO in the first place, then why on earth would we think it's going to go away, right? So I totally agree with you on that. And just as far as the diet goes, because obviously we're dietitians, and so we talk about diet and all that. Are there any other dietary mistakes? So we've talked about like just general malnutrition and focusing on elimination at all costs. Is there any other diet mistakes that you see people making in the SIBO community?
I think we've mentioned a lot of the big ones that I see. So like diet stacking, anytime you're stacking multiple diets on top of each other, to me, it gets a little bit dangerous in terms of getting optimal nutrition in. I do think going lower carb is a really big one. Again, it's trying to starve things out, but there's such a hit to hormones when you go too low carb at all costs. And it also affects the microbiome long term. So that's another really big one. I think in general, just having it take over your life is really problematic, because if all your focus is on the dietary piece, you can't focus on a lot of other really key pieces that are important to overcoming SIBO, like movement, sleep, stress management. Like all these things are really key in a number of different ways. So if you're focusing 90% of your energy on, you know, this diet and 10% on like managing supplements, there's no room for anything else in your strategy. And that becomes really problematic. So I think really balancing your time out and not over focusing on the diet piece is really important.
Mm-hmm. I want to just tap on that carb thing you mentioned a couple minutes ago, because as many of my followers know, I'm kind of like, I feel like I kind of made my name on bashing low carb diets. Bashing is probably not the right word, but kind of addressing their shortcomings and not letting people just like assume low carb is the best for everybody. And I'll never say that low carb is bad for everyone. Like, I don't think maybe there's a couple diets out there that I'd be like, I really don't think that's good for anybody. But, when we're talking about a real food approach to nutrition, I think there are circumstances where low carb can work, low fat can work, more of like a plant focus. I don't know if I would ever put someone on a vegan diet, but more plant focused diet is fine for some people, more animal focused diet. Like I think there's a lot of opportunity for diversity in healthy diets. But when you do super low carb, and especially if you're combining it with like low FODMAP or like, just generally not getting enough calories, there's a lot of negative stuff that can happen. And so I have a feeling, and I could be wrong, but from what I've seen in like 7 years of working with health clients, I think there's a lot of situations where a low carb diet could actually lead to somebody developing SIBO. Have you seen that?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say for sure, but I think theoretically, a lot of mechanisms that are key for digestion can start getting bound up when you go low carb. So, I mean, from my standpoint, you can have thyroid hormones start to tank, and that's going to slow down motility. It's going to affect stomach acid. It's going to affect a lot of different things. Even the migrating motor complex, which keeps the small intestines clean between meals, is linked to thyroid function. And I think cortisol dysregulation as well. I mean, that can totally slam digestion. It's going to hinder it and affect it in a lot of different ways. And I also think just the nervous system in general needs some level of carbs, and the nervous system's what's driving digestion. So that's certainly at play. And then lastly, like, you need healthy levels of certain microbes that get depleted on lower carb diets, even lower FODMAP diets like bifidobacteria. And if you kind of start dipping lower carb, what I've seen is more dysbiosis. And it could be a number of different reasons why that's happening and why low carb's creating that. But from my standpoint, it's all boiled down to your body's now in a more stressed state if you're not meeting your carb needs. And it has to rely on other sources of fuel to balance your blood sugar. So really, to digest well, your body needs to feel nourished. And if you're not meeting your carb needs, then your body doesn't feel nourished. And so digestion's going to be slower. And then you're not going to be able to get into that rest and digest state. So I'm very much in agreement that going low carb could definitely be a root causal factor for SIBO. I have my suspicions on a couple of clients that have come to me on like carnivore. Some of their GI map testing is crazy and wonky for sure from a microbiome standpoint. And I'm in agreement. Like, I don't think there's a time and place for a low carb diet. And, short term, there could be some benefits of going low carb, but most of the people that I have worked with that have gone low carb, it's not like a short-term temporary thing just to kind of calm down some inflammation in the gut. It's like a long-term struggle to get off of diet. So, and I think once you go low carb, it can be a little bit challenging to pull them in. And there's sort of like a process that you have to work through to get carbs back up as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think it's important to admit, or I don't know if admit's the right word, but basically just like acknowledge that doing a low carb diet in our modern society is very different than a low carb diet in like a traditional culture like the Inuit or something like that. So, you were mentioning stress. So stress is much higher in our Western modern culture than it would have been. I mean, we're talking about chronic stress, not just like acute, oh my gosh, there's a polar bear kind of stress. So that chronic stress, chronic sleep deprivation. I used to get clients all the time that were combining low carb with like CrossFit as a workout, which I still to this day do not understand why that was ever a recommendation. Just understanding the metabolic pathway that CrossFit uses to fuel those workouts. Why on earth would anyone ever think doing a low carb diet with that was appropriate? I do not know. I've certainly done it before though, so I'm not judging anyone for having done it. But so you have like workouts like that are super, I mean, that's not a normal workout as far as like ancestral movement patterns are concerned. So, that kind of workout plus a low carb diet, or, some of the foods, the processed foods or the convenience foods that are low carb, a lot of times have a lot of these like sugar alcohols and stuff because they're non-caloric and don't contain actual sugar. But those sugar alcohols can feed bacteria pretty significantly. And if you have a lot of it, it could be feeding stuff that shouldn't be fed so much, or even overfeeding the good stuff can cause problems too. So it is something that I don't want to say that we're bashing like a traditional low carb diet that's paired with ancestral lifestyle habits. But I think we need to be really honest with the choices that we're making and how they all work together with the low carb diet, and whether or not that's actually something that's going to promote gut health or potentially lead to something like SIBO.
Yeah, 100% agree. I think in general, like for the dietary side of things, I've never seen someone come to me and is like super restrictive and it going well. So like, and again, part of that's probably just my philosophy.
Self-fulfilling prophecy too. Like the worse it gets, the more restrictive they get, right?
Yeah, for sure. And there's part of that, but I mean, it would be one thing if I saw people going really restrictive and it going well and like it being helpful, but usually the people that are most restrictive are doing worse. And obviously I work with people to help them have a more balanced approach. And usually the people that are more balanced when they come to see me tend to make progress faster because they're getting better nutrition, even if it isn't perfect by SIBO standards. So it's just one of those things where this idea that you have to be on this restrictive diet to get better is not accurate from what I've seen. So I just want to make that point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, and since this podcast is called Fed and Fearless, part of the goal is to help people get less fearful around food or less like, I don't know. It's been a really long time since I was afraid of any foods. Like, I feel like it's been years at this point. So sometimes I forget what it feels like because nowadays I'm just like, I eat literally whatever I want. And, there's certain things I won't eat because I don't feel great when I eat them, but it's not because I'm afraid of it. It's because I'm like, don't really want to have that experience. So, but I know there's still a lot of people out there that do struggle with fear around food. So do you have any tips for our audience on how they can start to dismantle or eliminate these fears, especially when they're dealing with something like SIBO?
Yeah. And it's interesting, like you talking about your own sort of mental process around foods at this point. I feel like when I work with someone, I usually like to put it in terms of like every food has a pro and a con, not like good or bad, but like some foods, especially in the gut health space, like if they are triggering and like cause a lot of problems, I'm not going to say like you should go hard on those foods. Like what you're saying, like if the cons outweighing the pros and it's just like not worth having that food, you have to figure out how to make those calls and be able to eat outside of like necessarily a strict range of foods, what that looks like. I do think that like probably the first thing that I'll work on with people is overcoming food fears, because I don't know how you meet nutrition needs if you can't necessarily get over that hump. I do think in the gut health space, because there's that other facet of having physical symptoms with adding foods in, it can be a little bit more challenging to overcome food fears because you have that like feedback loop of, okay, I eat this food and it could cause a reaction, or it did in the past, or whatever the neural pathways are kind of telling you about that food and what's going on from a mental standpoint can be challenging to overcome. So usually I look at like overcoming food fears as like both a mental, but also like, how do we manage the physical side of things too? So usually just in general, I'll have people go low and slow. So let's not try to eat a whole potato at once. If you haven't had a potato in a while, like let's take it like a sixth of a potato, wait a day, see how you do. I think mentally it's easier to be like, okay, I can have like a sixth of a potato. Like that's something that I can like comprehend doing at this point versus having a whole potato. And I think it helps your body get physically adjusted to new foods, because that's something I go over too a lot with the clients I work with, where if you haven't had potato in a while, is it that abnormal that you'd have like maybe some slight bloating or a slight discomfort going up in carbs or eating something you haven't had in a while? Like a lot of people that I work with are in this mentality, and it gets them locked into their diet because they think if they have a symptom at all and they're hyper vigilant of like, oh yeah, like I might have had more gas when I had that, so like I can't eat that. But to me, again, like some minor symptoms are pretty normal when it comes to reintroducing food. So I think even having that mindset can be really helpful so that you're not freaking out if you do have like some transient symptoms as your body's adjusting to new foods. If they're kind of more moderate, you might want to like watch it, maybe try it at a lesser amount. If they're more severe, you might want to table that food till a little bit later. But most of the time, if you're going low and slow, the process is easier. And if you do have a reaction, you didn't eat so much of it that it's going to be like disastrous in any way. So that's key. I do think you were talking about the mindset stuff too earlier. I think visualizing yourself eating a food, I know sometimes that sounds like very woo-woo for certain people, like, you want me to do what? But I do think if you can visualize eating certain foods before you eat them and it going well and it like providing sustenance for your body, but even imagining how your day goes after you eat a food. So like going through that process mentally, I think just allows your nervous system to stay calm when you actually do eat the food. So you've already gone through it once mentally. Doing it in real life is a little bit less scary from a conscious and subconscious level. So I like visualizations a lot when I work with people. Sometimes mantras can also be helpful for certain people, or doing things pre-meal to just kind of keep their systems in a good place to digest food. So whether that's breath work, I also have had people write down benefits of foods that they were scared of. So like, or not necessarily scared, but like having challenges to eat them. So if it was an orange or something that they wanted to add in, I'd have them look up health benefits and literally write them down. So they're starting to create new beliefs around the foods versus the negative beliefs that they've had sort of circling their heads ever since they had SIBO. So again, taking it slow, I think visualizing, doing any sort of like pre-meal rituals to help keep your body in a good space, and also just trying to work new beliefs around foods can be helpful. Those would be the main ones that I typically utilize when working with people.
And I love how a lot of it comes down to, if you expect a food to cause harm, a lot of times that could be the main reason it's causing harm. It's kind of the, I think that, what is it? The nocebo effect. It's like you take something or you consume something that would have been fine, but because you believed it was going to hurt you, it did cause a negative reaction. And I know that sometimes people think that that's like total nonsense, or it's like, oh, of course it's like actually bothering my gut and I can't eat it. But I mean, we know that the placebo effect is super powerful. And I feel like I heard this on James Wedmore's podcast the other day. And I don't want to say that this is, I think I trust James to tell the truth, but take it with a grain of salt. But he was saying that there's research that the placebo effect is actually getting stronger these days. Like there's something about the way our society is. I don't know if it's like social media or what, but basically that beliefs are actually having more of an effect on people's physical reactions and symptoms and recovery and healing than it used to in the past. So it's kind of wild to think that, like, for whatever reason, as our culture continues to evolve or like change or, head in whatever direction we're heading in, hopefully it's a positive direction. But these beliefs actually can make far more impact. And I wonder if part of it is that because we have so much information available to us on the internet, it's like you get bombarded with all this like quote unquote facts about something like SIBO, and you're reading it for hours a day, and you're up until 1:00 in the morning looking at, websites or listening to podcasts. And it's like, I almost wonder if because information is so much more easily accessible, ubiquitous, just like you could be, I'm sure you could be reading SIBO blogs for weeks on end if you wanted to. And I'm sure many people have, but it's like just having that constant bombardment of information. I feel like that makes these food fears probably so much more problematic because you believe so deeply that this is a problem and you've been exposed to that belief so much because of all the information that exists. And so I'm just kind of going on a tangent now, but I do wonder if that's becoming a problem where we're in this like information age and information is so widely available, but you're not getting any filter. You're not getting any like, how do I apply this to me? You're not really seeing any sort of balance between, okay, this is helpful, but not at the expense of this. So anyway, I don't know if that's really a question, but that's just kind of what I'm thinking about. Like I can only imagine it's just getting harder for people to overcome those fears.
Yeah, no, totally. And I honestly think the SIBO space is very negative. I don't know, like the hormonal space, if it gets like really, but SIBO gets very negative. Like I said, a lot of practitioners will tell their people they're working with, this is just like a chronic thing you have to deal with. So when you have like your practitioner that you're trusting to help you, telling you it's a chronic issue, I'm sure that does some stuff mentally that's not great, and sets you up to fail in some ways when you're thinking that way. And I do think in these SIBO forums, it's like attacking foods, attacking like ideas, and it does become like a war on food. So like a lot of times I'll work with someone and like, oh yeah, I read on the SIBO forum that this is a problem. And it honestly has to come down to changing your thinking of like, food isn't really the problem with SIBO. Like even having that as like a mantra, like as you're overcoming food fears, like food isn't the problem. it's the environment that's causing you to potentially react to foods. And by not eating foods, you could be creating a worse environment. So it's super key to examine beliefs and mindset, especially in the SIBO space, because there's rough mental terrain in the SIBO space from what I've seen personally and working with clients.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. Well, I've heard some different things because now that I'm doing primarily business coaching of other nutritionists, I do get like vicarious learning through them, like what their space is like. And I've heard some spaces like the PMDD space, for example, is very negative. And there's people that say like, you can never actually get like resolution of PMDD. And then they'll say, apparently, and I'm not in this space, but if you do get better, that means you never had it in the first place. I don't know if they've said that about SIBO, but yeah, it's wild. I mean, and I'm not saying these forums are terrible and totally useless or anything like that, but I do think we're getting into this place where that's what you're relying on for good information and for guidance and for support. You can get yourself into a lot of trouble because you don't have somebody objective to be like, oh, that's not really true. Or maybe that's true for some people, but it's not really applicable in your situation. Or even asking the question, like, how is believing that helping you, right? Like, is there a benefit to believing that you're never going to get better from SIBO? Probably not, other than, maybe they think they're helping them avoid the disappointment if they don't get better. But it's like, am I correct in saying that you have recovered from SIBO?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So I was like, I don't want to make any assumptions, but so, you have your own personal experience. You have a lot of client experience that people have overcome SIBO. And I feel like, people need to be really, and this doesn't just go for SIBO, this goes for any condition. People need to be really mindful of who they're getting their information from, what that person's mindset is like. Are they in a good headspace? Or are they like dumping their negativity on you? How is what somebody is telling you actually going to benefit you? Because even if it's a provider, if they're saying that you're never going to get better, maybe that's not the final story. And maybe there is someone else that you should be getting some quality information from, like Amy, for example. You're like, oh, stop. So I feel like I could talk to you for a long time. But maybe we'll have to have you come on for a second part 2 of the SIBO conversation, because there's so much that we could potentially talk about. And I know you're launching a podcast that may be already released by the time this episode goes live. But I know that you have a program that helps people get to the root cause of their SIBO and to help them overcome that root cause. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, for sure. So I have a program. It's called the SIBO Root Cause Repair Program. Basically, I've designed it to help you identify and address the root causal issues at play in your SIBO, so you aren't sort of going through this cycle of treating the SIBO, it coming back, or like you having to be restrictive to keep symptoms away. So it's getting out of that vicious cycle that I see not working in the SIBO space, like we talked about. So it's all about digging deeper as to why the SIBO is there in the first place. So with my program, it gives you the tools to create an optimal environment in the small intestine so that, you can manage the root causes of why the SIBO was there to begin with. So we talk a lot about like the brain-gut axis. I talk a lot about cortisol regulation, thyroid function, things like liver, gallbladder stuff, even pancreas stuff that could be happening. I talk a lot about stomach acid as well, and I also talk a little bit about adhesions, which is often not discussed enough in the SIBO space. But basically, I walk you through a process on how to identify, address these root causes so that you can find more long-term relief and not just short-term quick fixes that aren't going to be helpful at all long-term, which are usually what the popular protocols are, is like these short-term fixes, which might be great for a period of time, but not long-lasting.
Yeah, well, like you said at the beginning, SIBO is not a root cause in and of itself. And so you have to get underneath it to find out what led to it in the first place so that you can have long-lasting relief. And I think you had mentioned before we started recording that you had a little special gift or discount for anyone who's a listener if they want to join that program.
Yeah, if you want to join the program, you can use the coupon code FEARLESS to get a discount. It'll be awesome if you check it out.
And then you also have your podcast coming out. What's the name of that podcast?
Yeah, the podcast is IBS Freedom Podcast. It should be up and running and multiple things going on over there if you want to check it out. It's with another SIBO nerd like myself, Dr. Nikki Dineza. So we just kind of talk all about SIBO and IBS and those sorts of things. It's fun.
I love it. Well, super exciting to hear that you've got all that awesome stuff going on in your business. And I know that we just barely scratched the surface of SIBO today, but I think it's definitely an interesting angle that I don't think a lot of other practitioners are necessarily talking about. And, we're kind of backing up from the whole protocol piece and saying, where is your mindset at? What are the potential reasons why you even got here in the first place? And how is your mindset affecting your ability to recover from this issue? So I've really enjoyed chatting with you about it, and we'll share the links to your program and if we have them for your podcast. And then where can they find you on social media?
Yeah, you can find me on Instagram at Amy_Hollenkamp_RD. It's a lot of underscores. And then you can find me on Facebook as well. I believe it's SIBO Diaries. So that's my blog. So I do have a blog too. That's SIBODiaries.com, where you can find me. And I have a Facebook attached to that as well. So those will be the main social media stuff to follow me on.
Cool.
Yeah.
Well, we'll link to all of that as well, so you guys can go follow Amy. I love her stuff. I think she does a great job of explaining the science and the practicals of SIBO recovery, and also making sure that we never ignore the mindset and the bigger picture of everything, because it's so important and it really does make a difference in people's healing. Anyway, thanks so much for coming, Amy. It was really great to get to chat with you, and thanks to everyone for listening, hanging out with us. Go check out Amy's program. It's awesome. I thank you for joining us. We'll see you here next time on the Fed and Fearless podcast. Take care, everybody. Hey there, Laura here again. Thank you so much for listening to the Fed and Fearless podcast. Your time is your most precious resource, and I'm so grateful that you choose to spend some of it with me. Now, if you're enjoying the podcast and want to continue supporting my work on this show, I would very much appreciate it if you would leave a review on iTunes. By leaving a 5-star review, you'll help others find the show and help me spread my message to a larger audience. You can go to fedandfearless.com/review to find a button that'll take you right to iTunes to leave your review. And I have a special gift for you as a thank you for helping me share the podcast. Once you leave your review, send a screenshot of the review to hello@lauraschoenfeldrd.com. Or you can DM it to me on Instagram at lauraschoenfeldrd. Once you do, I'll share a free copy of my Overcoming Undereating ebook. Then share a favorite podcast episode in your Instagram stories and tag me at lauraschoenfeldrd. And I'll also give you a free copy of my 14-day calorie challenge recipe guide. Together, these bonuses are worth $44 and will help you become Fed and Fearless. And you'll get them absolutely free for just helping me grow the podcast. Again, thank you so much for your support, and I'll see you here next week for the latest episode.